Hello. So let's get started with this talk on the history and appreciation of typography. So thank you for joining this YouTube stream. This is a new experience for me using YouTube to broadcast to a tiny proportion of the world. So typography is the study of placing printed words on paper and screens. And most of us are surrounded by typography for most of our waking hours. This can be in books, newspapers, advertising, websites, and so on. And with type being so ubiquitous, we can appreciate our surroundings all the better by having a little knowledge of the history of typography and some guidance as to what good typography looks like. So first, let's consider why we care about typography. Surely, if you're just conveying the information in the written word somehow, does anything else matter? Could not the chat manifesto be scrawled in purple crayon on the back of a Lidl receipt and still impart its important message? Admittedly, in the grand scheme of things, typography doesn't really matter that much, but I do have two reasons to care that I'd like to put forward here. The first is that meaning should not just be conveyed, but it should be conveyed with the minimum of inconvenience to the reader. The smaller the cognitive load that you place on a reader in the presentation of an idea, the greater the cognitive capacity you leave for the reader to absorb the idea. So typographers smooth the telepathy between the writer and the reader by helping effective communication through clear communication. The second reason I'd like to present for caring about typography is that it's a form of expression. Different ways of presenting text send subtly different messages to the reader. For example, Teen Magazine will present text in a manner that's rather different to the text presented in a letter from a bailiff. And to me, it seems as though typography is analogous to clothing or indeed architecture. They notionally fulfill a mundane practical purpose, but in real life, typography, clothing, and architecture all send out strong signals about the writer or the wearer or the inhabitant of a building. So, where did typography get going? Well, the world's earliest complete printed book is the Diamond Sutra. This is a Buddhist text and it's lodged in the British Library. And this book was indeed printed, but it's rather different to the Western idea of type. It was printed using a single large carved block of wood for each page, rather than small blocks of type that could be broken up and reassembled to be reused for a different print job. This technology did develop in East Asia though. It started off in China in around the 11th century, where they first started using clay to cast Chinese characters in type and then moved on to using wooden type later on. But neither clay nor wood was really robust enough to handle mass print runs, and the technology never really caught on. But more robust metal movable type was developed on the Korean peninsula around 1230, and there is a document called Jikji, dating from around 1377, a Buddhist document, and this is the oldest extant document to be printed using metal type. This document is lodged in the National Library of France in Paris, but this metal type technology from Korea didn't really catch on in a big way. It's really a matter of speculation as to why that might be. Possibly, I speculate that it could be simply the large number of characters used in the writing systems of the region. So, how did printing really get off the ground? Well, it was with this fellow, Johannes Gutenberg. He was born in Mainz near Frankfurt, and while he didn't make a single earth-shattering innovation, he made a series of more minor innovations that together were absolutely revolutionary. So he developed a process rather than an individual innovation. So the elements of this process included oil-based inks, mass production and use of movable metal type, an alloy of tin, lead and antimony that was durable enough for printing, but it still melted at a low enough temperature that it was easy to cast and recast the alloy into lead type. And he also created a printing press that was based on the agricultural screw presses of the time. And with these innovations put together, it suddenly became practical to produce documents and books in bulk. And so ideas could be shared and transmitted with ease. And this was a key factor in the launch of the Renaissance and the development of science. So it was even more revolutionary than the creation of the internet. And when Gutenberg first started printing, he printed things like papal indulgences, allowing people a certain number of swears and so forth. And he also produced a Latin grammar and a few other bits and bobs. And the purpose of this was to fund his masterwork, which was the 42-line Bible. And this was completed in 1455. It took 5 years to produce, and he produced 180 copies, which sold out immediately because it was far cheaper than a Bible that was hand copied by a scribe. And what's really notable about this 42-line Bible is that it's far from being typographically rudimentary. It is actually considered to be one of the greatest works of typography of all time. And the reason for this is that Gutenberg was determined to prove that his printing technology could equal the best handwritten manuscripts. There's about 21 copies of the 42-line Bible still extant, including 2 in the British Library and 1 in the US Library of Congress. So another person notable in typography is William Caxton. He saw the printing technology while he was traveling in what is today Germany, and he set up a press in Bruges in 1473 and another one in Westminster in 1476. And he printed works mostly in English, and he often translated them himself. And as a result of the sort of wide distribution of printed texts in English, he inadvertently found himself in a position where he was homogenizing the various regional dialects of English at the time. His contribution to printing is significant enough that he is honoured with a stained glass window at Guildhall. So how did Gutenberg's technology work? So it was all started off with something called a punch, which is something that we see on the left-hand side here. And so for a particular font to be used by printers, a craftsman called a punch cutter would cut the letters for that font by hand into these steel punches. And this was a highly skilled job, but it only needed to be done once for a font. It didn't need to be distributed to multiple printers. There just needed to be one master copy, because once that letter had been cut into a punch, then a printer could hammer the punch into a soft metal like copper and create this thing that we've got here, second from the left, which is called the matrix. And from the matrix, the printers could produce the actual type that was used for the typesetting by using the matrix as a mold and pouring in the molten lead alloy and casting these slugs of lead used for printing. And so there could be unlimited copies of the matrix using one punch, and then from one matrix there could be unlimited copies of the slugs of lead. And these slugs of lead with a letter on them are called sorts. And a printer who ran out of sorts during a print job would be unable to continue with the job, and this gives us the expression out of sorts. Another good thing about Gutenberg's technology is that when these sorts became blunted through multiple uses in printing, it was very easy just to melt the lead slugs down and recast them into fresh sorts. And these slugs would be put into a typesetting case like this, and the typesetter would pick letters out of this case and load them into something called a composition stick, which is what we see on the left here. And by convention, the typesetter would have two cases, with the capital letters kept in the uppercase and the smaller letters kept in the lowercase, and that's where we get the expression uppercase and lowercase in terms of talking about big letters and small letters, or minuscules and majuscules. Using this composition stick, the typesetter would be building the page from the top of the page being at the bottom of the stick, and everything being a mirror image of what was going to be printed. The resulting page would be called a form, but with all of this mirror image and upside downness, it was rather easy for an inexperienced composer to get confused between the letters B, D, P, and Q. And it may be that this is the origin of the expression mind your P's and Q's. So once the form was ready with all of these metal slugs in it, the printer would coat it with a thin layer of ink and load it into a press like the one we've got on the right here. And such a press could produce up to 240 pages an hour, compared to maybe 3 pages a day for a scribe. So there's a couple of people I'd like to mention in this large and venerable industry. First one is Benjamin Franklin. So as you all know, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, appears on the $100 bill. In his youth, he was actually a printer and typesetter, and he did a stint in Smithfield, and in what was to become the USA. In the 13 colonies, he founded a newspaper and used it to propagate the ideas of the American Revolution, and he printed American currency as well. Another notable name in the world of type is Beatrice Ward. She is particularly notable because she rose to prominence in an industry that was almost completely dominated by men. And she worked as publicity manager for the major printing company Monotype, an Anglo-American firm, for over 30 years. And she's best known for an essay she wrote called The Crystal Goblet, in which she explained her philosophy of typography as a means of communicating ideas through a clearly polished window. So that idea of smoothing out telepathy again. But printing technology didn't stop advancing with Gutenberg. So it was in the 19th century that printing technology started to improve with the introduction of iron and steam-powered printing presses. And this led to improvements in printing speeds, but the setting of type was still this tedious business of having these cases full of type and setting them by hand in a composition stick. But in 1884, there was a major breakthrough with the introduction of a technology called hot metal typesetting. And here we have an example of a machine used in hot metal typesetting. It's used molten lead sloshing around with the composer sitting at the keyboard that you can see in the lower part of the machine. And as they typed on the keyboard, the molten lead would be used to create the forms for doing the printing. It's a gloriously steampunk kind of device, and if you look out for them, they often crop up in museums. This example I saw in the museum in Swakopmund in Namibia, of all places. They were used for creating newspapers as well as paperback books and so forth. So moving on from the linotype, intertype, hot metal typesetting technology, in the 1960s and the 1970s, as well as clothing taking a nosedive aesthetically, a technology called photo typesetting took over, which was easier to and cheaper to do because it used characters imprinted on film negatives to set type on photographic paper. So no lead needed, but the effect on typographic aesthetics was severe, as you can see from this book at the bottom right here. The classic fonts had to be redesigned to allow them to survive the photo typesetting process, so fine lines didn't really work. It worked better with sans serif fonts with consistent width of strokes in the letters, and it became more difficult to typeset complex text like mathematics correctly or attractively. And fortunately, the quality of typography improved dramatically when computers started to become more widespread. And so here we've got my personal typography hero, a computer scientist, widely regarded as the greatest computer scientist of all time, Donald Knuth. And he was working on a very mathematics-heavy series of books. And in 1976, he received the galley proofs of one of the volumes of this book, and they'd been photo typeset, and he was so disappointed with the quality of them that he decided to write his own digital typesetting system. And he was expecting it to take about 6 months, but it ended up taking about 10 years. But it's still used by mathematicians today, and it's only fairly recently that professional publishing software from the likes of Adobe, things like InDesign, which is a top-end typesetting package, are able to exceed the quality of its output. It's still tech that I use today. And thanks to computers and desktop publishing, quality of typography has increased dramatically, and the best typographers in the world tend to work for companies like Microsoft and Apple and Adobe. And you also today, in the same way that we get craft beer and artisanal baking, hand presses have started to appear again, and you sometimes see works from hand presses in specialist bookshops. So there's a potted history of typography. Now let's take a look at some finer points of typography to help the uninitiated appreciate high quality typography when you see it. So first thing I'd like to mention is ligatures. So if you've got an F and an I next to each other on a page, then the dot on the I tends to sort of butt up against the bowl of the F, and it doesn't look good. And so printers long ago came up with a separate glyph called a ligature, which combines the F and the I. And that would have been a single sword, a single slug of lead would have been used to print that. And the same is true for double F, FFI, FFL, and even TH can be printed as a ligature, and text will look the better for it. And then for a flourish, there's ligatures for CT and ST. If you live in London, you might have seen the estate agent Chesterton's uses the ST ligature. So yeah, something to look out for there. Another thing to look out for in good quality typography is small capitals. As internet savvy people we are, we know that using all capitals when you're writing is considered shouting, and when you're printing text, it's it's conventional if you're having capital letters in running text to make them the same size as the lowercase letters like the E's and the X's. And a naive way of doing that is just to shrink down the capital letters to a smaller point size, but that makes the strokes on the letters too thin. So in good quality typography, you'll have a separate small capitals font that has got the capital letters at the same height as the E's and the X's, but with the same stroke width as the rest of the font. So another bit of typographical pedantry there. That's how it should be preferred. Another bit of typography is old style numerals. So with old style numerals are an alternative to this style of numbers, which is fine to see on the side of a van or on a business card or something. But when you see numbers in running text, this can interrupt the flow of the reading. And so in good quality typography, it's preferred to use what are called old style numerals, where the tails of the numerals drop below the baseline. And this is easier on the eye and is considered to be better quality typography. So that's something to look out for. Optical font sizing. So this is something that you don't even see in all over the place in even really rather good typography. So if you are printing a title for a book, then the natural thing to do is just to increase the point size of the font, just to magnify it. So here we've got Kedgeree written in 2 different sizes, but the proportions of the letters tend to start looking wrong if you make them bigger in a title. You actually tend to want the proportion of the letters to look different from how they would look in continuous text. And that's most plain to see if you take this font, which is designed for very small letters, for example, in a superscript, and then blow it up and the letters look too wide. And this particular font has got optical sizing designed for different sizes. So if it was going to be used in the title in the same font, you would have narrower versions of the same letters. And doing this is an indicator of particularly high quality typography. So another thing to look out for in good quality typography is the absence of these dumb ticks, as they might be called. So having a straight quote comes from typewriters, where there was naturally a limited number of characters that you could have. And so both an open and closed single quote and apostrophes were all represented with this vertical tick. So if you've got somebody reporting a greengrocer's apostrophe and they use a dumb tick like this, then the joke's on them, because they should be reporting it using a 9-shaped inverted comma like this. So that is the preferred way to present an apostrophe in good quality typography. Similarly with double quotes, having straight double quotes like that is frowned upon. Much better to use 6699. The good news there is that Office software, like if you're typing an email in Outlook, it will typically do that for you automatically. And the fact that it takes the trouble to do that is an indicator of it being a worthwhile bit of typographic practice. So dashes are another touchstone of good quality typography. So on a typewriter or on a computer keyboard, you just have one dash that's used for everything. But in the same way that there are different types of spoon for tea, coffee, desserts, soup, absinthe, and so forth, so there are in good quality typography different types of dashes. So there's a type of dash for the minus sign. There's a type of dash for a range of numbers or combining 2 nationalities, for example. You've got the M dash, so when that's used when you're separating off, offsetting a bit of text within a sentence. That's a longer dash than the N dash. These are 2 handy words in Scrabble. And then you've got the quotation dash, which can be used in place of inverted commas for speech. James Joyce preferred to use quotation dashes over inverted commas, which he called perverted commas. And then a particular bit of pedantry in typography is something called the figure dash, which is a dash that is the same width as the figures in the font, so that you can put dashes in tables of numbers. Here, this is an American phone number, and you don't mess up the columns that the numbers might appear in on a page. Another thing to look out for in good quality typography is the use of exotic characters. So being fastidious about using diacritics, which is the typographical name for accents on letters. So for example, on the U here, the umlaut is known in typographical circles as a diaresis. And you might see things like this backwards P, which is known as a pilcrow in the trade. A particular one to look out for is the proper use of ... known in the trade as the ellipsis. It's bad form to present that as just 3 full stops after each other. Instead, there will be a separate character in the font, which is explicitly the horizontal ellipsis. There's also a vertical version that can be used sometimes. Again, Office software, things like Outlook, will automatically convert your ... into the correct character. A particular thing that I like to see in typography is the use of diphthongs. This is where 2 vowels are combined together to make another vowel in words like medieval and oeuvres, and aesthetic. I find that aesthetically pleasing, and if somebody's taken the trouble to use a diphthong in some text, it's a bit like wearing a detachable collar or having working cuffs on a shirt. On a jacket. It shows attention to detail. So another thing to understand in typography is the distinguishing between Roman, italic and bold text and when to use them. So the typical normal serifed font, a Roman font that you might see in a novel, say a Penguin paperback, is called Roman font, as we all know. This is based on the Carolingian minuscule style of writing used by scribes in the Holy Roman Empire between about 800 AD and 1200 AD. And when you're using, say, Microsoft Word or something, and you make it italic, it will actually just sort of slant it over like this. That is not actually an italic font. That's called an oblique font. Italic is actually another style of scribal writing, another way that scribes wrote using an italic nib, and that's easiest to see when the text, if you set some italic text and you put it upright, you can see that it looks much more calligraphic, so to speak. And italic is used for titles of works, and it's also used for emphasis. It's not a good idea to use bold for emphasis. Bold is best used to make a word catch the reader's eye as the reader scans a page. So it's good for things like headings in encyclopedias and dictionaries. It's particularly bad to use underlining in printed text. That's very much frowned upon. If you are going to emphasize, as I said, it's the typographical convention is to use italics. Not so much nowadays really, but in the olden days when desktop publishing was quite a novelty and people produced newsletters with lots of different fonts and underlining and bold and so forth used indiscriminately, typography enthusiasts would sniffily refer to it as ransom note typography. Something else to look out for is 2 broad families of Roman fonts that can be categorized into humanist fonts and modernist fonts. So even quite a skilled typographer on opening a random book would be hard pressed to precisely identify the font that the page has been printed in. And sometimes books will have in them something called a colophon, which may appear at the front or the back, which indicates what font the book was printed in and maybe what size the font was and who printed it. And one way of subcategorizing Roman fonts is whether it's a humanist font, like we have on the left here, where the thinnest part of the stroke is at an angle, as if it had been drawn by a human hand with an italic pen. And that's easiest to see in the letter O, but it's also actually present in letters like B as well. Whereas a modernist font, modernist referring to kind of machine production and a sort of more rational way of doing things, so to speak, this axis is vertical with the thinnest bits at the top and the bottom. And modernist fonts tend to have more contrast between the thickest and the thinnest parts of the font. And that is relatively easy to spot in a page of printed type. So I'm not going to shy away from a particularly controversial area of typography. I'm going to talk briefly about Microsoft Comic Sans. So there's a lot of sniffy disapproval about Microsoft Comic Sans. It was actually originally intended for a little animated dog to produce speech bubbles in an earlier version of Microsoft Windows. And it made its way into fonts that were generally available to users, and it started to be used rather too widely. So the most egregious example I've seen of the use of Comic Sans is this document here, which I saw in the Genocide Museum in Yerevan, Armenia. And it's a declaration by the city of Rome that the Armenian genocide took place, acknowledging that it happened. That's a sort of diplomatic gesture. And this very somber and important document had been printed using Microsoft Comic Sans, which struck me as about as inappropriate use of the font as you could possibly get. But Microsoft Comic Sans does have its uses. It's good for taking the edge off passive aggressive notes, like saying, please keep the door closed. But that can backfire. So somebody responded there saying, please don't use Comic Sans. We're not a lemonade stand. So it does have its uses, such as in comics. Oh no, I've used Comic Sans. But a graphic novel enthusiast would no doubt tell you that there are better options available. Kerning is another area of study in typography. Kerning is the spacing between letters, usually in a word. And it's not something one normally notices, and computers do it for you automatically with modern technology. But when people were typesetting using lead sorts, they would have had to have thought carefully about the spacing of the individual letters. And when it goes wrong, it does look very bad, as in the first line here. We kind of have something saying Kemming. The kind of time in when preparing documents that people might have to worry about kerning is when typesetting titles or something like that, where the letters might need to be shifted around to make the spacing look right. Then another area of study in typography is breaking lines. So if you're typesetting text so that each line is the same length, then the words might have the lack of consideration to be exactly the length that you need to fit the line, so it's necessary to hyphenate them, as we have all seen probably hundreds of thousands or millions of times in our lives. And exactly how you do this nowadays is controlled by the computer software, but in the past typesetters would have had to have thought about this carefully. Modern computing technology actually has some very clever stuff that can subtly alter the size of the letters pretty imperceptibly to the human eye, but to the extent that it can make the difference between having to hyphenate and not having to hyphenate. And this is a great achievement in typography, not least from the point of view of printers who can still use the full width of the paper, not wasting any blank space, and not bothering the reader with hyphenated words. This technology isn't actually new though. Gutenberg's 42-line Bible made this. This was something that scribes did, and Gutenberg used this technique in setting the 42-line Bible to reduce the need for hyphenation. This document is nevertheless hyphenated, not as much as it would have had to have been. And if you look very closely, you might be able to see that the hyphens poke out to the right of the text block, as do full stops and commas. This is called hanging punctuation, and is considered to be very high quality typography because it makes the text block look very neat and rectangular. There's no consensus on whether typesetting ragged right, as it's called, with just leaving white space on the ends of words if the next word won't fit in at the end of the line, whether that is better or worse than having a text that fully fills the line. That's up to a graphic designer to decide. Something I've learned from reading about typography is that you really need a professional graphic designer who spent years at art college studying huge amounts of source material to develop a feel for what looks good and what doesn't look good in certain situations. There's not just a sort of list of rules that you can learn. But a disadvantage of ragged right, as I touched on earlier, is that it uses up more paper. So from a commercial point of view, it's less desirable. Alignment. So how to place the lines on the page. So here we've got centered alignment. So centered text is a good way of making a page always look balanced, and it's a sort of safe but fairly old-fashioned way of doing things. Again, it's a matter of aesthetic judgment rather than a rule. The British Board of Film Classification switched from using centered text to using flush left text for their certificates, and using flush left or flush right, where you've got everything starting at the same place on the left hand side, or on the right hand, ending on the same place on the right hand side, can make the text look like it's got more strength, but it is a matter of judgment rather than a rule. So it's something that people think about when they're designing layout. And indeed, the layout of the page is another major area of study. This is a picture showing what one typographer proclaimed to be an ideal layout, although I can't see a commercial printer agreeing with all that blank space on the page. So a rule of thumb for the ideal margin sizes is that the margin should be in the ratio 1 in the middle, 1.5 at the top, 2 on the side, on the outside, and 3 at the bottom. It's good to have space at the bottom so that there's space for the reader's thumbs. And when designing layouts, the Greek golden ratio of approximately 1 to 1.618 is considered to be a good one to use. That's thought to be the golden ratio, the ideal ratio between the sides of a rectangle. That doesn't fit in very well with A4 paper, which is 1 to 1.41, 1 to 1.414. So graphic designers and so forth will think carefully about how to design the layout on a page, especially with respect to commercial and aesthetic considerations. So where can you see examples of good typography? Well, the good news here is that good examples abound these days. It's not like the 1970s. Any commercially produced paperback is likely to have a good to excellent typography. Penguin Books, their books are always very well typeset, and they employ some very talented designers. Faber and Faber take a lot of pride in their typography. They even have a hand press that people get familiar with the roots of the craft on at Faber and Faber. And I would be doing Clayton a disservice not to mention the magazine Resign. When I first joined the New Sheridan Club about 10 years ago, I was more obsessed by typography than I am now. It's an interest that's got a nasty tendency to crowd out all other interests, so I don't recommend you actually get too interested in it. And I was very pleasantly surprised when I first saw Resign and how well designed it was. And it was no surprise to learn that Clayton has been a professional in the field. So if you do want to learn more about typography, then there's a couple of books I can recommend. The first is The Non-Designer's Type Book by Robin Williams, not the actor. This is a book aimed at sort of ordinary people to give them an appreciation of how they can improve the design of their documents. And then if you want to take things further, there's this book, The Elements of Typographic Style, by a typographer and poet by the name of Robert Bringhurst. And he treats typography as an almost spiritual pursuit and writes about it with great passion. So if that interests you, then that's a good book to check out of the library. So thank you for listening. That's the end of my talk. I'll see if there are any questions in the chat. If you do have any questions, then please fire them into the chat and I will attempt to answer them. I haven't mentioned typewriters. Yeah, typewriters don't really count as typography. The idea of typewriters is just to do it at all rather than to do it well. They were a matter of necessity. Stephen asks, are different languages suited to different fonts? Yeah, that's certainly the case with non-Roman scripts, like Greek and Japanese will of course need different fonts. I've not actually come across, say French or Italian using a different font to English or Finnish, say. There are different typographical conventions in different languages. For example, in French, it's quite normal to put a space before a colon as well as after it. Great, thank you. I will end this stream here. See you on the Zoom. Thanks for listening.